Chapter 14 of Workers Together. This recording is in the public domain. Workers Together, or An Endless Chain, by Pansy. Chapter 14. A Crisis. "If they had shown a little gratitude," muttered Robert, "it wouldn't have seemed quite so ridiculous. But that absurd woman kept quoting Timmy somebody to you, as though he must certainly know more than you did." The doctor laughed good-humoredly. "You must recover from special sensitiveness before you take up any work for the world," he said. Now that didn't disturb me in the least. In fact, I rather liked it. Why should she immediately throw Timmy Nolan overboard and take the advice of a total stranger? Timmy is a grand fellow, one of the Lord's freemen, who is trying as earnestly as he can to lessen the misery there is in the world. He puts full faith in me, too. I have no fears but that my directions will be followed as soon as Timmy learns that they are mine. He is a character, that Timmy Nolan. I would like to have you study him. He murders the Queen's English fearfully, but he belongs to the royal family nevertheless, and with his 8 shillings a day, and a wife and 4 children to support, contrives to do more for the cause of Christ around him than any other 2 men with whom I am acquainted. But, Parks, since you are sensitive on the subject of my wisdom, what do you think of men who quote all sorts of human authorities as though they are worth infinitely more than the Word of God?" Robert answered him in positive irritation. "Your thoughts all come back to one point, whatever subject is touched. I don't know how to talk on such themes." "Then you mustn't quarrel with the Lord's plans of work until you understand more about them. By the way, I presume he has a plan for you to work by, that you have never so much as looked into. It is a subject entirely worthy of your consideration." Saying which, Dr. Everett suddenly whirled around the corner, and reined in his horses before his boarding house, unceremoniously ordering Robert into the house and up to his bed for a rest. Thither the young man presently went, with some new thoughts stirring in his heart, prominent among them being the one, that Dr. Everett certainly ordered his life by motives to which he, Robert Parks, gentleman, was a stranger. For several days thereafter Dr. Everett watched with no little anxiety the result on his patient of the pictures of life he had shown him in one morning ride. To the grand house belonging to the senior partner of the store, where he was employed, to give him a hint of the fact that sickness came to those who were far above him, so far as this world's goods were concerned, and brought unrest with it, as surely as it did to him, the portionless young clerk. What the doctor wanted was, to have his patient see that the unrest lay not in the fact of his dependence and inability to meet the money demands of the day, but in the fact of an unquiet heart, unable to accept God's planning and rest in it. Then he desired him to see another type of sickness equally far removed from his own, so that Thomas Riley, in his ill-kept home with his comfortless surroundings, might say to the young man, "What am I, that life should have served me better than this?" "I took him out for a tonic," the doctor told Mrs. Saunders, "and I am not sure but it was too strong a one. I'm watching the effect with no little anxiety." "Why," said matter-of-fact Mrs. Saunders, "he didn't seem to take a speck of cold, and I should think it was too late now to be afraid of the effect of that ride. It was 3 days ago." Whereupon the doctor turned smiling eyes on Joy, as he said, "It was a fever, and not a cold, that I feared." "Fever!" said Mrs. Saunders. "Why, he is as pale as a ghost." And both the doctor and Joy laughed. Yet the anxiety for Robert remained. It very soon became apparent, however, that the tonic or something else had done him good. He roused to something like interest in life, made an effort to eat the strengthening food prepared for him, and resolutely turned his thoughts away from fretting anxieties, as much at least as he could. He was even betrayed one evening into asking how Thomas Riley prospered. "Nicely," said the doctor, much satisfaction in his voice. "The fever was quite subdued by the time I reached him the next morning. The window was just as you arranged it. The extra quilts were banished. and he told me, with a smile of gratitude which would have delighted your heart, that he had just as much water all night as he could drink; that Timmy Nolan came to sit by him, and let the mother get a bit of sleep; and that Timmy said, 'If Dr. Everett orders a swallow of arsenic every 5 minutes all night, you just take it and be aisy. It will do you good. He knows what he is about every time.' I told you Timmy would be loyal. Mrs. Saunders, the most a great many of these people need is a helping hand. They do the best they can for one another. It is the fact that nobody has taught them how, which makes them so helpless and miserable in sickness." When, a few days afterwards, Robert inquired for the senior partner, Dr. Everett admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that he was at his post again in the store, feeling certain that a fit of restlessness would follow this item of news. More than that followed. Robert came down to breakfast the next morning with an air of determination such as he had not worn before, and announced his intention of reporting himself for duty. "I have lain by just as long as I can," he said emphatically. "If I haven't strength enough yet, I must work without strength. They have waited for me a much longer time than they generally keep places, and now that the senior partner is out, they will not wait quietly much longer. No, Mrs. Saunders, I must go today. I will be as careful as I can." And he went. But he was a very pale-faced and weary-looking young man for several weeks thereafter. Dr. Everett watched him, and reflected sadly over the unnatural life of late hours and nervous excitement which he must have led, to have made his body so unwilling to rally from the effects of a comparatively slight accident. "He lays all his trouble to the frightened horse," the doctor said, speaking to Mrs. Saunders. "But the truth is, late hours, late suppers, much smoking, and occasionally wine, are what have sapped the strength from him." "Do you tell him so?" questioned Mrs. Saunders, and the doctor shook his head, smiling. "What use? I must rather contrive to have him tell himself so." Whereupon Mrs. Saunders shook her head. She did not understand such intricate ways of working. She believed in the outspoken truth. But she had another trait somewhat rare in women of her stamp. She believed in Dr. Everett, and where she could not understand, she trusted. It was toward the close of a busy, wearying day in the great store. Robert Parks had charge of one of the variety counters, and a most nerve-trying charge he found it. Buttons and thread and silk and tape, and pins and needles, and a whole army of trifles, had a way of mixing themselves up in inextricable confusion. At least the confusion seemed to Robert inextricable. He had lost a great deal of the spring out of his life that makes trifles powerless to annoy us. His head ached. The systematic bustle which had been about him all day long, and which used to give him satisfaction, confused and wearied him in an unaccountable manner. It was his evening out, for which he was thankful. He told himself that if he were obliged to endure the strain of 3 hours more at that counter, he believed it would end in his being taken to an insane asylum. And then he had added to the same gloomy being, that it might as well end that way perhaps. Either that or the poorhouse was before him. Don't be too harsh in your judgment. It had been a most trying day. Everything had gone wrong. All sorts of difficulties had beset him. The most troublesome customers in the city had seemed to congregate at his counter, and toss over and disarrange 100 trifles they did not want, asking questions about them the while, and continually calling for more things to add to the confusion. Twice had the cashier disputed his figures, and angrily silenced him when he tried to explain that he was right. The exasperating cash boys had giggled outright over several of his mistakes. The chief of his department had sharply reprimanded him for keeping a disorderly counter, only 2 minutes after the disorderly female who had tumbled it had turned away, to have her place taken by 3 others before he had time to write anything. To climax his trials, Fred Briggs, the most disagreeable clerk in Robert's estimation that the store contained, had been removed to the stand next to his own, and had proved one of his most prominent thorns all day. Poor Robert was beginning to feel that his flesh was full of thorns, and that life was a very sore and burdensome thing. But by far the heaviest disturbance of the day was hastening on to find him all unprepared for it. Half an hour before the time for his release, he was summoned to the private office. The senior partner was there, himself suffering from recent illness, and feeling the nervous strain of a long day filled with business cares. Robert, listening to the sharp, keen voice and concise sentences, contrasted them with the weak, complaining ones in which he had heard him address Dr. Everett when he lay in his luxurious chamber. Had he grown strong since then, he wondered, or did work look hard, almost impossible to perform? It was not probable, for in that case he would have remained in his elegant home. No stern necessity sent him out. Robert, you observe, had yet to learn that the unrest of a man's own heart sends him out oftener than does any other motive. Presently the metallic voice was ready to address him. The cashier with whom he had been talking was dismissed. "Mr. Parks," he did not take the trouble to look at Robert while he spoke, but wrote rapidly the while on a sheet of paper that lay before him, "I hear that you have received a counterfeit note today. I regret it, on account of your recent illness and long absence. But our rule must be respected. We have been very lenient with you as regards rules already. Perhaps that has been a misfortune to you. The counterfeit note will be deducted from your next month's salary. Of course, if you had obeyed the rule of the house and reported your note immediately to the cashier, instead of making change yourself, it would have been all right. Both you and he would have been saved much trouble. But since you chose to ignore rules, you must abide by the consequences." Robert's pale face had been taking a flush of color during the delivery of these sentences. But he controlled his voice to answer with some degree of respect, though with marked hauteur, "You have been misinformed, sir. I haven't had the honor of even seeing a note today, nor a large sum of any description. It has been a 10-penny business at my counter all day long. I know nothing about the note in question. May I ask why it is charged to me?" He had the benefit, then, of a stern look from the senior partner's gray eyes. "Of course it has been traced to your counter before being charged to you," he replied, and his voice was more metallic than ever. "I might add that your manner is somewhat unbecoming. Such haughtiness on your part, coupled with insinuation of false or, at best, hasty charges, are, to say the least, decidedly out of place. Of course we know in this store what we are talking about before we speak." "It seems not, sir." The red color glowed on Robert's cheeks now. "Else you would not charge me with having received a counterfeit note, when I have received no note today. Is it to be supposed that I speak falsely in making this statement, or what am I to think?" The senior partner arose. "Mr. Parks, I shall have to remind you to remember to whom you are speaking, and to drop that tone and manner at once. As to what you are to suppose, it really makes extremely little difference, so far as I am concerned, what you suppose. I am not in the habit of being called in question by one of my clerks, especially one to whom the firm has shown such recent and unprecedented kindness. Still, despite the peculiar manner in which my words have been received, I will endeavor to explain for your benefit. Young Briggs says that you twice today received notes, that he was at leisure at the time, and observed you making change, and thought strangely of it. Moreover, he frankly owns that he assisted you in breaking the strict rules of the store, emboldened, I presume, by your previous example. He united, he says, an account to yours, and a young lady, who had been making purchases at both counters, made payment to you in a note. Now, of course, you remember that such a process is entirely contrary to the manner in which business is conducted in this store. You certainly have not forgotten that the cashier of your department is the proper person to make change." It was utterly impossible for Robert to control his voice further. It rose to a pitch that might easily have been heard outside. "And I repeat, Mr. Cady, that I haven't touched a note today. I've never had a poorer day for business. If you choose to believe Fred Briggs's lies, you will have to do so. I cannot explain them. I am not a spy on him. I don't know how many bills he has or has not handled today. But I know that I have obeyed rules, and that I am telling the truth. And, moreover, sir, I am in the habit of being believed, and I will not have my word groundlessly challenged by anyone. Chapter 15. Recording by Trisha G.